Welcome to the AI Research Roundup. I'm Alex. Today we are looking at a paper trending on X, published on December 5th, 2025, about 6 days ago. It introduces a training-free way to steer powerful three-dimensional generative models with explicit spatial control, so artists can feed in rough geometry and reliably get detailed, realistic three-dimensional assets that closely match that shape. The paper is titled, SpaceControl, Introducing Test-Time Spatial Control to 3D Generative Modeling. And as we will see later, this single control knob over realism versus geometric faithfulness makes the method surprisingly practical for real creative workflows. Alright, Figure 1 makes the idea very concrete. The top panel shows light blue geometric sketches, like rough superquadratic shapes for a plane, cat, rocket, and house, alongside the final colorful three-dimensional assets that closely wrap around those guides. The bottom left sequence illustrates editing a chair sketch to add slats and armrests, which produces matching detailed chairs. The bottom right sequence does the same for sofas, controlling width and pillows through simple geometric edits. So, while Figure 1 illustrated what the system can create, Figure 2 explains how the pipeline works end-to-end. The left column encodes the spatial sketch, the text prompt, and an optional reference image into a shared latent space. The central block, called the structure flow model, gradually denoises those latents to produce a clean voxel grid that fixes the object geometry. The right block, the appearance flow model, then adds fine surface detail and color, finally decoding the result into meshes, radiance fields, or three-dimensional Gaussian splats. So while Figure 2 explained the pipeline, Figure 3 shows what the single control knob tau0 actually does. The left plot tracks chamfer distance and FID score as tau0 increases, revealing that stronger control makes shapes more faithful, but slightly less realistic. The elephant row then illustrates this visually, shifting from a natural but loose pose toward a chunky, highly constrained toy elephant as tau0 rises. Alright, Figure 4 compares how different methods respect the same light blue control shapes across several object categories like boat, chicken, and whale. The top row shows those simple superquadratic guides. The middle rows with Coin 3D and the Spice models often drift from the guide or produce messy, distorted assets. The bottom row, with the proposed method, keeps proportions and part placement much closer to the controls while still looking like polished, stylized three-dimensional toys. So, while Figure 4 gave visual side-by-side examples, Table 1 reports the hard numbers. The table compares geometric faithfulness through chamfer distance and realism scores across toys 4K, chairs, and tables. SpaceControl consistently achieves the lowest chamfer distances, which means shapes follow the input geometry much more closely. At the same time, the FID and point FID columns stay competitive with or better than the Spice and Coin 3D baselines, so realism is not sacrificed. Well, while Table 1 compared methods, Table 2 zooms in on how the control parameter tau0 changes things within this approach. The rows show that as tau0 increases, the chamfer distance drops dramatically for toys 4K, chairs, and tables, so geometry sticks much closer to the input shape. At the same time, the FID and point FID scores stay relatively stable, which means overall realism does not collapse. The separate primitive and mesh columns confirm that this trend holds whether the spatial control is very coarse or quite detailed. Alright, Figure 10 shifts from single objects to full scenes. The left panel shows chunky colored superquadratic blocks that roughly indicate chairs, a table, a screen, and walls, which act as the input spatial control. The right panel shows the corresponding detailed three-dimensional furniture assets that match those layouts, with realistic materials and decorations. Each object is generated independently and then snapped back into place, so a coarse scene sketch turns directly into a coherent furnished room. SpaceControl shows that a single training-free control knob can turn rough three-dimensional geometry, from simple blocks to detailed meshes, into realistic assets that actually respect the intended shape. That unlocks much faster sketch-to-asset and interactive editing workflows for design, games, and film. That is it for this episode of the AI Research Roundup. I am Alex. Thanks for listening.